Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us in this presentation of Signs and Symptoms, or Is I Is or Is I Ain't. At the end of this presentation, I'd like for you to take advantage of the online assessment tool that we've provided, which will give you an opportunity to take a look and see where you might be in all of this, or if you or someone you love may have a problem. Again, thanks again, and we'll move on to the next segment. I'm Dr. John McClanahan, and I'm a addiction specialist in Annapolis, Maryland. I'm also a recovering alcoholic. Over the next couple of hours, hopefully you'll have an opportunity to gain some information, some insight, maybe even have an opportunity to make a determination of whether you or someone that you care about has a problem with alcohol or other addictions. Also, we're going to do this, like I said, in 4 segments. The first segment will be basic X's and O's, what addiction isn't, talking about the stages and how we've changed the way we look at this over the years. The second segment will be early stage symptoms. The third segment will be middle stage symptoms. And the last segment will be late stage symptoms. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I always like to put in somewhere when I do something like this that thanks for being here and thanks for helping me stay sober one more day. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first segment that I do, I'm a firm believer that in order to understand what something is, it's also very important to understand what something isn't. I do a variation of this in a separate session where we talk about what I like to call demystifying addiction. There's a whole lot of myths and half-truths and stereotypes and that type of thing. Some of them I'm sure you're very well aware of. Some you might not be. But like I said, I think to get the total picture of what addiction is, we have to understand what it's not. So that's what we're going to take a look at in this first little segment. One of the things that you might be familiar with, go back to grade school on. It's a concept that we use in journalism and writing. It's called 5 W's and an H. And everybody in here can think back to 5th grade when you had to write a theme or my summer vacation or some paper or something along those lines. And the 5 W's and an H are basically the framework that a story is hung around. You know, the what, the when, that type of thing. Well, a number of years ago, I found that, and I'm sure not by accident, that what addiction isn't and what it is also falls into this framework very nicely. So I want to start off with that, and then we'll take a look at the stages of addiction and set the tone for the other 3 segments. The first thing that addiction has absolutely nothing to do with is what the person's doing. Okay? Huge misconception. You ask most people on the street to define addiction or the addict of whatever kind the person may be. First thing comes to mind is usually it's an illegal substance. Okay? Even if it's not, if you have the rare person that may say, well, alcohol certainly is the most abused drug in the world, so that falls into, most people don't consider that. Okay? Addiction has nothing to do with what? It's not just a substance, okay? We have a whole series of addictions that have a name now to give it a little bit more validity, I guess, but they've been around forever, and they're called process addictions. And a process addiction is more of a behavior. The compulsive gambler, the overeater, the compulsive shopper, the internet addict, things along those lines. It has nothing to do, again, with what? If you look at the word addiction, it tells you exactly what we're going to look at and what we're up against. The word addiction comes from a Latin word, addictus, that means all-consuming. Or another loose translation of that is to devote one's entire being to. It doesn't say anything about only if it's something you drink or swallow or smoke and that kind of thing. It's got nothing to do with that. So it's got nothing to do with what the person's doing. It's got nothing to do with when they do it. It's another huge misconception. The old adage and stereotype of somebody who's doing whatever 24/7. Some people end up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I certainly did. Some people not. They're more binge drinkers, more binge alcoholics. One of the things, just to give you a little aside, we've come a long way in terms of this as well. We used to have a name for the binge drinker that didn't make a whole lot of sense because people would kind of misinterpret very often to their own benefit what that meant. We used to call the binge drinker the periodic alcoholic. And in the wrong hands, somebody would interpret that as, well, yesterday I was an alcoholic, today I'm not, tomorrow I might be, okay? There's no, if about it, okay? Either you are or you're not. So we don't use that word periodic anymore. So again, it has nothing to do with when the person's doing it. It has nothing to do with where. And that shows itself in two ways. It has nothing to do with where the person's from. The old, really kind of tacky adage of people for years used to always talk about people on the other side of the tracks, or those people, and that, that kind of, it's got nothing to do with where you come from. It's got nothing to do with where you do it. Go into a bar and ask anybody in there to define the alcoholic. Almost to a person, he or she will say, well, it's the person that drinks alone. It's not me. I'm out here, having a good time, buying drinks for friends and that kind of thing. Not hurt, I'm just having a good time. Ask the person who drinks alone, and they're going to tell you the exact opposite. Well, it's those people out there ripping and running and creating problems. Certainly not me. I'm not hurting a soul. It could be neither one of them, or it could be both of them. It's got nothing to do with where they do it. It's got nothing to do with who they are. I tell people all the time, and this might sound really flip to some people, but people will ask when they come into group, what am I getting myself into? Who's there? Not specifically who's there, but what can I expect? And I tell people, in all honesty, I've got corporate CEOs sitting next to people that wouldn't know a job if they fell in one, and you can't tell who's who. 98% of the addicted population looks like me. Not what society says that the addict looks like. 98% looks like me. Anybody sitting here, okay? So it's got nothing to do with who. This is another big stumbling block for a lot of people. The last W is it has nothing to do with why the person's doing it. Everybody knows somebody, and I certainly did it. You may have done it as well. Well, if you had my wife, you'd drink too. You had my husband, you had my job, my kids, lived in my neighborhood. Addiction is a biochemical change. It has nothing to do with why a person started to use. I tell patients all the time, if you find out one day you're allergic to strawberries, you didn't become allergic to strawberries because of why you started to eat them. It's a biochemical, biological change. Your body can't handle it or process it anymore. So it's got nothing to do with why. It has everything to do with how it affects you when you do it. Okay? It was an old way of kind of diagnosing people. It wasn't very clinical, but it certainly gave us a little insight at the time. Excuse me. We used to ask people, have you ever drank or used more than you intended to? And if the answer was yes more than once, you needed to take a look at what was going on. Well, we've given a little bit more leeway now, where it's not that specific, one time and that's it. But we have to start to look at a pattern. And you'll see that as we go through all of these symptoms and situations over the next couple of hours. So again, the reason I think this is so critical, society for years has looked at addiction that has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with that. The problem is, addiction has nothing to do with that and everything to do with that. So it's not the what, the when, the where, that type of thing. It's how it affects you when you do it. Over time, you'll see eventually it becomes a loss of control, not lack of control, but loss of control. And you'll see that as we go through this as well. What I want to do right now, just keep this in mind when we talk about the how. One of the things that when we look at how it shows itself, how does it illustrate itself in people's behavior and that type of thing, One of the problems that people for years have had, and I happen to be in one particular camp with this, addiction is not a symptom of a problem. It is the problem. Alcoholism, cocaine addiction, compulsive gambling, whatever face it wears, it is the problem. It's not a symptom of something. And for years and years and years, people kind of looked at it backwards. And over the last number of decades, finally, we've come to understand that that's not necessarily the case. Okay? It has absolutely, again, nothing to do with those things. It's how it shows itself. And the definition of an illness plays right into the how. When people say, well, it might be an illness, but it might be a self-inflicted illness. I've never met one person, I've been doing this for almost 30 years, I've never met one person that woke up one day and said, I'm going to start to drink or use or gamble because I want to be an addict when I grow up. Okay, this was not a choice. I tell folks all the time, I didn't stand in line on career day in high school and decide, I want to be a drunk when I grow up. But that's exactly where things led. So it's not, yes, I chose to pick up the first drink, but so do about 90% of the people in the country. For about 10%, it becomes a problem. For the other 90%, it's a purely social, recreational thing. So when we talk about the definition of a disease, it's kind of a flowery thing, but the dictionary definition, the medical definition of a disease, they talk about it's a condition that has symptoms that are specific unto itself. And that's just a whole lot of stuff that means if you have this, you've got the flu. If you have this, you have a heart problem. And if you've got these things, you have an addiction problem. So addiction meets all the criteria of not being a symptom of something. It is the something. Okay? It has symptoms that are specific unto itself, and you'll see that here in a little bit. So when we talk about the how, the way we looked at this a number of years ago was basically a four-part frame of reference, I guess. We don't look at it that way anymore. We simplified it over the years. First stage for years was looked at as something was called pre-alcoholism or pre-addiction. Okay? Now basically we talk about pre-addiction now, but in a whole different way, and we'll look at that here in a second. Pre-alcoholism, decades and decades ago, basically had almost an environmental tie into it. It's almost like if you hung around people that drank long enough, you were going to become an alcoholic. I tell folks all the time that, don't panic, just being around me, you're not going to catch it from me. If you got it, it's not my doing, okay? You might learn how to drink. You might learn how not to drink. You might learn how to lie, but you're certainly not going to learn how to be alcoholic. It's not a behavior. It's a physical, entity all to its own. So the first stage that was looked at was something called pre-addiction or pre-alcoholism. Second stage that we looked at, and I always tell folks when I do a lecture like this, is one of my favorite words in medicine and healthcare, the word prodromal. The word prodromal comes from a word that means the quiet before the storm. And I always thought that kind of lends a romantic air to all of this. So here we have, hang around it, you're going to catch it. Here it comes, the quiet before the storm. It's not there, but it's not a matter of if, but when. Okay. Then we looked at something was called the crucial phase. And crucial really was kind of a throwback almost to the old moral model of see it or else. Change now or else. Kind of see the light or you're doomed. Okay. Then the fourth stage that was looked at was something they called the chronic stage. So basically the way you had this laid out was hang around it, you're going to catch it. Here it comes. It's here, do something or quick or else. Too late. And there was no time frame. that said it's going to be years and years between each one of these. In fact, the way it was looked at was the further you got down here, the quicker the deterioration and everything became. So it's almost like by the time you got to here, and I'll mention this in a minute because this has a real personal importance to me. By the time you got to this point here, if you didn't do something, it was almost like you had, just days, the way they looked at it, before it turned into too late. We don't look at it in these stages anymore. We have another way to look at it. And we look at it in a very simplistic way. We don't talk about pre-addiction or pre-alcoholism the way we used to. Okay? It's not an environmental thing. When we talk about pre-addiction, we're talking about genetics. There's a predisposition to the illness. Okay, so anytime we talk about pre-addiction, we're looking at biology, not environment. We also don't talk about prodromal phase anymore because there's no quiet before the storm. The storm is already there. It's just really subtle and it's hard to diagnose. You'll see this in the second piece when we look at symptoms of early stage alcoholism. And it's when I do a version of this in my DWI education groups, a lot of people who are in there where really this is an isolated event, addiction's not a problem for them. Very often some of the symptoms they see in early stage, they'll look and go, oh my God, I've done that. So in early stage, it's not the occurrence, it's the frequency. So in early stage, which is what we call this now, okay, it's very, very hard to diagnose that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. We don't talk about a crucial phase. There's not a make or break period, get it or too late, okay? We call that middle stage or middle phase. And it might be splitting hairs, but to me, middle says it all. Okay? Middle is not all that good, not all that bad, but there's kind of some hope in there. Crucial makes it sound like, again, just the way it was meant to sound. Get it or you're doomed. We don't talk about a chronic phase anymore because the whole illness is chronic. Chronic just means there's no cure. I was just as chronic up here as I am here. I've been sober a long time, and I tell especially new folks coming in that I'm just as alcoholic now as I was 28 years ago. Hey, the difference is I'm a sober one. I'll die alcoholic. I can't change that. What I have control over is whether I'm a sober one or not. One of the things that keeps me focused in my own recovery is reminding myself, no matter where I am in my sobriety, in reality, it's still here, and I'm one drink away from being the new guy if I forget where I come from. So again, it really is important to understand that there isn't a chronic get it or else, or you're doomed, in this case, phase. The whole illness, there's no cure. We have treatment. We can live, very productive, happy, wonderful lives. But again, I'm still alcoholic, okay? Pardon me. We refer to that now as late stage. So instead of all these other stages, it's been simplified a little bit into early, middle, and late. And that's a whole lot easier for a lot of people to remember as well. There's another way to look at this. It might seem a little bizarre to some people. And I remember learning this years and years and years ago. Early stage is fun. If you can imagine any phase or stage of an illness being fun. Okay? Early stage is fun. Middle stage is fun with problems. Fun with consequences. Okay? There's consequences to the use, but there's still more good times than bad times. Okay? Late stage is all problems. It's all consequence. The late stage alcoholic, cocaine addict, gambler, again, whatever he or she may be, at this point, they're not using to have fun, to be the life of the party, the reward at the end of a bad day. Late stage addict is using because he or she can't not use. It's total loss of control. One of my definitions of addiction is kind of simple. When the cure for the problem becomes the cause, that's when we have to take a look at what's going on. And that's what you start to see happen, is all of a sudden, and you'll see, especially in as we go through the various symptoms, you'll see this pattern, you'll see the progression of this. So by the time we get to late stage, nobody's having a good time. Nobody's getting what they're looking for out of their use. The person's using because they can't not do it. Okay? There's another way to look at this as well. And this is something that I realized a while back. I used to do family work as part of the programs that I did and that type of thing. And one of the things that we would talk about very often in those sessions would be signs and symptoms. Just how to recognize if a person that they cared about had a problem, or where his or her loved one might be in all of this. And I noticed that there was something very unusual. Another way to kind of lay this all out. In early stage, I don't know if you can see that or not, I'm sorry. In early stage, nobody sees it. Okay? Again, it is so difficult to diagnose early stage addiction. Let me change colors here. Okay. Okay. In middle stage, everybody sees it except the person who has it. Okay? This is where you start to see interventions taking place. People might start to look at and criticizing and questioning people's behaviors and that type of thing. But the individual, he or she doesn't necessarily see it just yet. Okay? In late stage, everybody sees it, including the person who has it. Father Martin used to refer to this as the moment of truth. This is where the person makes a decision: do I keep going this direction, or do I take a chance and maybe get well and stop the insanity type of thing? So the way we look at addiction now, it's early stage, middle stage, late stage. Again, in kind of a goofy way maybe. Fun with problems, all problems, or nobody sees it. Middle stage, everybody sees it except the individual. Late stage, everybody sees it, including that person. I'd mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the things that I'm so glad they changed the way this is all kind of spelled out now, because a number of years before I got sober, they were still looking at it in these terms. Okay? Now the problem is, most people, if you just kind of look back to this way of nobody sees it, then everybody but, okay? Here you are at crucial phase, and that's the see the light, get it or else, or you're doomed. Nobody sees it until we get to this point in the first place, and then by the time we finally see it, we're down here. Most people don't even come in to take a look if it could potentially be a problem until somewhere in here. Okay. In all my phony attempts at sobriety, and not to mention the hundreds and hundreds of days when I'd wake up in the morning and that's it, I quit, and 2 hours later all bets were off, or 2 hours later that's long enough, or you promise, that's it, I quit, 30 days, no more. And a couple hours later, who's looking? Okay, a lot of us, we've been there. Okay, most of the time when I was going through and started going to meetings the first time, it was to basically to please everybody else. I didn't have a problem. That was somewhere around here. By the time I finally came to the realization that the common denominator in all my problems not only is me, but the other common denominator was the drinking. And most of us don't see that until we're in here. Years and years ago, I think a lot of people that may have had an opportunity or should have had an opportunity to come into sobriety, to come into recovery, may have been kind of steered the wrong way, or maybe we just thought, if you'd come in a week ago, might have changed, but too late now. It's never too late. I don't care what stage a person is in, it's never too late to make the changes. Okay? So when we talk about this again, going back to what we're going to look at in the next couple of segments, and this first segment's kind of short, just to kind of lay the groundwork for this. Addiction, again, has nothing to do with what the person's doing, when they're doing it, where they're from, where they're doing it, who they are, why they're doing it. It has everything to do with how it affects them when they do it. Okay? I use kind of a silly example to show the difference between social, recreational use and addiction. And how you start to see all this play out and how it affects the person when they do it. Okay? I like to tell people that drug use and addiction is kind of like riding on a bus. Okay? In social, recreational use, everybody in here has probably had the opportunity to ride on a bus at some time in his or her life. You're sitting on the bus, and you're getting close to your stop where you want to get off, and you reach over and you pull the cord or push the strip or whatever mechanism they have. You do that. The bell rings, light goes off up front, sign says stop requested. The bus driver sees that, he or she pulls over. They open up the doors, tell you to have a nice day, and you get off. Okay? In addiction, it's very, very similar to you're coming to your stop, you're getting ready to get off, you reach over, you push the button, push the cord, whatever, push the strip. The bell rings, the sign flashes, stop requested. The bus driver acknowledges it and keeps on going. You're going where the bus driver wants to go. The bus is driving, the drug is driving the bus, not you, not the individual. Okay? That's total loss of control at that point. Okay? That's the how. Okay? And then in the next segment, what we'll do is we'll look at early stage symptoms. This is where the how part, again, what we're going to look at for the rest of the time will be the is I is or is I ain't. How do I know what it looks like? How do I know if it's a problem, and to what degree? So, like I said, the next segment we'll just pick up and we'll do some early stage stuff. And again, I want to thank you for being here for this last segment. And before we finish, I'd like for you to take advantage now of the assessment tool that we had spoken about.